Most people think a data breach is a single moment. Okay, a company gets hacked, data gets stolen, passwords get reset, and then it's over. That's the version we usually hear in headlines. That's not how breaches actually work. In reality, a data breach is rarely the end of the story. It's the beginning of a long chain of consequences, many of which don't show up for months or even years. Today, we're going to walk through what really happens after a data breach. Not the headlines, not the press releases, but the behind-the-scenes reality that affects companies, employees, and everyday people like you. And by the end of this video, we'll understand why even a so-called small breach can cause damage that never truly goes away.
Breach Bites TV.
Let's start with the moment a breach is discovered, or more accurately, the moment someone finally realizes something is wrong, because most breaches are not detected immediately. In fact, industry studies consistently show that the average time to identify a breach is measured in months, not days. That means attackers often have weeks or even years inside a system before anyone notices. And this delay matters more than most people realize, because every extra day an attacker remains undetected gives them more leverage. They aren't just sitting idle, they're watching how employees log in, they're seeing which systems trigger alerts and which don't. They're learning the rhythm of the business. They learn when backups run. They learn when security teams are most active. They learn which alerts get ignored because they happen all the time. By the time a breach is discovered, attackers often understand the environment better than the people defending it. And that imbalance, not the initial exploit, is what causes the most damage. Think about that for a moment. An attacker doesn't rush in, grab data, and leave. They settle in. They observe normal activity. They learn how the organization operates. They figure out which systems matter and which ones don't. By the time an alert finally triggers, the attacker isn't improvising. They're executing a plan. During this quiet period, attackers are busy. They map the internal network. They identify privileged accounts. They locate databases and file shares. They test which security controls are active and which aren't. They may install backdoors. They may create new accounts. They may modify existing ones. Okay, most importantly, they make sure they can come back later. So when defenders eventually respond, they're often responding to only part of the problem, the visible part. This is also when attackers quietly test boundaries. They'll access a system just to see if anyone notices. They'll download a small file. They'll attempt to log in during off hours. If nothing happens, they push further. This slow, methodical approach is why modern breaches don't look dramatic at first. There's no alarm, no flashing warning, no immediate shutdown. It's a subtle activity that blends in with normal behavior. And the longer it blends in, the harder it becomes to tell what's legitimate and what isn't. Once suspicious activity is detected, everything speeds up. Security teams scramble to isolate systems. Executives are pulled into emergency meetings. Legal teams get involved. Public relations starts drafting statements. This is where one of the most common and dangerous mistakes happens. The focus shifts away from stopping the attacker and toward managing the fallout. Questions like, how bad does this look? Who needs to be notified? What can we say publicly? These questions matter, but not yet, because at this stage, attackers may still have access. Resetting passwords doesn't remove backdoors. Shutting down one system doesn't protect the rest of the network. And in many cases, organizations don't fully understand how the attacker got in to begin with. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths in cybersecurity. Discovering a breach does not mean you're back in control. It only means you've noticed something. And in many cases, organizations don't realize they're dealing with multiple attackers at once. One group may have stolen data. Another may still be inside the network. A third may be waiting for the chaos to create an opening. Incident response teams often have to assume the worst, because assuming the best is how breaches get worse. Now let's talk about the data itself. When data is stolen, it's almost never used immediately. Instead, it's copied, organized, categorized, stored. Think of stolen data like inventory, email addresses, usernames, passwords, social security numbers, medical records, authentication tokens. Each type of data has a different value. Some data is useful right away. Some becomes valuable when combined with other breaches. Some sits untouched for years before it's ever used. This is why breaches don't feel finished. Because the stolen data doesn't vanish, it circulates. Once data leaves an organization, control is gone forever. There is no delete button. There is no recall. There's no way to know how many copies exist. Data gets traded. It gets bundled with other breaches. It gets resold, repackaged, and redistributed. Something stolen today might not be used until years from now, when defenses have changed. People have moved jobs, and vigilance is lower. That delay is what makes breach fallout feel random, but it isn't random at all. It's simply delayed. This is where the long-term damage begins. For individuals, the effects of a breach often show up slowly. You might notice a suspicious login attempt, a password reset you didn't request, a phishing email that feels uncomfortably personal than maybe, a locked account, a fraudulent charge, a credit alert you didn't expect, and often you don't connect it to a breach that happened years ago. But attackers do. They reuse stolen credentials in what's called credential stuffing attacks. They take username and password combinations and try them everywhere. Email, banking, cloud services, social media. And because so many people reuse passwords, this technique works far more often than it should. This delayed impact is deeply frustrating for victims. By the time fraud happens, the breach feels ancient. People have moved on. Companies have rebranded. Headlines are forgotten. But stolen data doesn't age. It doesn't expire. Doesn't lose relevance. And attackers are patient. They wait for moments when people are distracted during life changes, financial stress, or major world events. That's when stolen identities become most profitable. Identity theft isn't usually a one-time event. It's a long process. Attackers test small actions first. They apply for low-value credit. They probe financial systems. They see what goes unnoticed. Then they escalate. And because stolen data can be reused indefinitely, victims may deal with fallout for years. All from a breach they barely remember. For organizations, the damage doesn't stop after systems come back online. There are obvious costs: incident response, forensics, legal fees, regulatory fines, but the most damaging costs are harder to measure. Customer trust erodes, business partners hesitate, employees lose confidence. Recruiting becomes harder, retention becomes harder. Every future security decision is scrutinized. Some companies recover, others never fully do. Not because the breach destroyed them technically, but because it damaged their reputation permanently. Here's a part of the story that almost never gets discussed. Every successful breach teaches attackers something. They learn which defenses were weak, which alerts were ignored, which employees clicked, which controls were missing or misconfigured. That intelligence doesn't disappear. It gets reused against the same organization, against similar organizations, against entire industries. Breaches don't just cause damage. They train attackers. After a breach, companies often say, "We fixed the vulnerability." But vulnerabilities are rarely the real problem. The real issues are usually weak identity controls, excessive permissions, poor visibility, slow detection, over-reliance on perimeter defenses. If those issues aren't addressed, the breach will repeat, maybe not in the same way, maybe not immediately, but eventually. So what actually works? Early detection. Strong identity security, multi-factor authentication everywhere, continuous monitoring, assuming compromise instead of assuming safety. Security isn't about preventing every attack. That's unrealistic. It's about limiting damage, because once data leaves your system, you don't get to take it back. The real lesson isn't that attackers are unstoppable. It's that breaches are processes, not events. They unfold slowly. They hide quietly. They linger long after the headlines fade. Understanding that reality is the first step towards stopping the next one. It's the organizations that recover fastest aren't the ones that say this won't happen to us. They're the ones that plan for when it does. There's also something most breach coverage never talks about: fatigue, security fatigue. Every notification, every warning, every headline slowly trains people to stop reacting. When breaches happen all the time, they start to feel inevitable, normal, almost background noise. And attackers know this. They rely on it. They know people reuse passwords because they're tired. They know alerts get dismissed because teams are overwhelmed. They know updates get postponed because there's always something more urgent. The breach doesn't succeed because people are careless. It succeeds because people are human. And modern systems are designed in ways that quietly punish human behavior instead of accounting for it. That gap between how systems expect people to behave and how people actually behave is where most breaches truly begin. One of the hardest parts about data breaches is that they rarely feel personal at first. They're just numbers. It's just headlines, just another notification. But over time, those numbers turn into real consequences. Real stress, real financial damage, real loss of trust. And by the time the impact is fully felt, it's often too late to undo. Data breaches don't end when systems come back online. They echo. Through stolen data, through lost trust, through years of consequences. The more you understand what really happens after a breach, the better prepared you are to protect yourself and the systems you rely on. If you want more breakdowns like this, subscribe to the channel, because security isn't about fear. It's about understanding reality before it becomes your reality.